And there's also that parallel we should also say, and I'm jumping ahead again, but you wrote a piece about the 2018 primaries that talked about the DCCC coming in and basically being at odds with with local folk running for office or trying to recruit candidates. And I combined the reporting you did there with the I think it was Theta Scotchwell and Lena Putnam. I think I'm getting her name wrong. I think, and there was one other person who did similar research. And the stories were similar. Some of it involved ideology, but some of it was just like, hey, we're the experts and we come from Washington.
Yep.
We know what we're talking about, and you're going to do what we say because also this is our business. Like, this is how, we throw money to certain consultants, and then when I move on to my next job, they get me my next job, or they help me out, or they're social friends. I mean, people experience this in their real lives all the time. It's just that the stakes are a little bit less public-y.
Yeah, and the best example of that would probably be Laura Moser in that Texas primary, because she was not an insurgent leftist candidate. She was part of the resistance. She launched this daily action app that let people make a single text or a single phone call a day to resist Trump. She was pro Pelosi. She was just a fairly liberal Democrat, but her husband worked for Revolution Messaging, the consulting firm that kind of worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign, which meant that it was the black sheep of the Democratic consulting world. And when they attacked her publicly, this made big news. It was so strange that the DCCC was attacking a Democrat publicly. One of their most significant takedown points of her was that she had used her husband's consulting firm for some work, which was just a hilarious charge for the DCCC to make, because the executive director of the DCCC's wife was at the time getting a bunch of contracts from the DCCC, and that's how the DCCC does it. That's not an anomaly. That's just what you do. And the fact that they highlighted that to me was a tell that it was about the consultants. That, like you said, she was not using one of us. This is a threat to the if Revolution doesn't just do Bernie Sanders campaign but starts doing winning House campaigns, then that's a threat to the whole DCCC consulting nexus.
And so that's an important, I think, a thing for people to keep in mind, that I think we tend as people who, follow politics and are engaged because of ideological reasons, presume that everything is based on ideology, when sometimes it's just based on, I just want my friends to be able to get paid, because that means that I get paid at one point. And that is, that's, I think, an important thing to understand, at least in terms of when you're looking at this stuff. And it also, which gets back again to that sort of central hinge of your reporting here in this book, is that where you get your resources from ends up being a huge part of every decision that you're able to make at any given point. And I don't want to skip too much over the Dean era, but in many respects, he was the one. Jerry Brown tried it, but Dean, in the internet age, it seems to me, built the framework for, and I'm not saying he himself, but the people on the campaign built a framework for the small donors. And so many of the people that influence our politics today in some way, particularly on the left and the more populist arguments, came out of that campaign. Right.
And he fits with what you were talking about, less ideological and more
Yes.
just fighting spirit. Like he himself wasn't terribly progressive. He
At all.
appeared that way because he was anti-war. He's from Vermont. He was a doctor who was into universal health care. And so you take those things together and you're like, this guy's probably progressive. We've since learned that that's not necessarily the case, but he was one of the few people who was willing to go right at Bush when Bush was at the height of his war popularity. And so that willingness to fight is what gathered so many people around him. And I think, that's a big difference between his campaign and Jackson's. And, Jackson didn't have the ability to translate all of the energy that exploded around him into small dollars that could then be invested in TV ads and building the infrastructure of a national campaign. Whereas Dean did have that. And so it took him from a huge long shot of a candidate to the front runner and presumed nominee for a while.
And there was
until Democrats decided he wasn't electable, but that's another story.
Well, yeah, I mean it's an interesting story too. I mean, insofar as there was intense dislike of Dean on the campaign bus, as it were. Like the press didn't like him. There was. That was where sort of, and again, like this point can't be made enough. Dean is a perfect example of this. Dean was rather conservative, at least, from a financial standpoint, and as governor of Vermont. And the dislike for him was in many respects like the fact that his campaign was the birth of, I think, like the amateur journalists and the activist journalists that came with the blogs that the press really hated at that time. I mean, really, with a white hot passion.
Right. It's hard to quite appreciate how much they hated bloggers at that time. I mean, you can kind of sense some of it just in the rhetoric around the pajamas and sitting in their mom's basement, eating Cheetos. But yeah, they felt like, and also, it was all bound up in they felt the collapse of the print journalism industry. And the most obvious and easiest people to blame would be the bloggers, rather than, Craigslist and all the other, threats to the print, industry. They saw these people as the ones that were driving them out of business. And it's just a couple of punk kids who had no idea what they were doing as far as the press was concerned.
And it wasn't even just that from a business standpoint, because I don't even think they were aware of what was happening from a business standpoint. It was a status thing. Like you and Marcos Militis, but forget Marcos Militis. I'm trying to think of what Nate Silver's handle was, like Paco something or something.
Right.
Right. You don't have the same authority to talk about politics as I do, and the idea that people are reading Atrios and some guy whose name we don't even know. And, are equating, Atrios with me, who works for the New York Times, is disgusting. Like, I mean, it was literally that type of like personal, to the point where people thought that Atrios was Joe Klein, I think it was, because they wanted to imagine like, oh, there's no way just some boob is writing with this level of insight. And so that's what happens going forward from there. And that's where everything starts to take off, right? Like the blogs that are empowered by Dean was empowered by the blogs in many respects. And those people start to infiltrate different offices. And the biggest, I think, sort of like dynamic change from a politician because of that, it seems to me you write about, is Harry Reid.
Yeah. And I had always gotten that sense, and so it was nice to be able to talk to him about that and kind of walk him through it without prompting him. And he said that he went to the first yearly Coast conference, and he said I didn't quite know what this whole thing was about, but I could tell that it was going to be big, that there was energy around it. It was something new and important, and I wanted to be on the front end of it rather than, the middle or the end of it. And then he ends up, hiring people out of that, out of the blogosphere into his office, and they start using the office of the majority leader eventually as in a weaponized way that the left has always said, that political power should be wielded. A bunch of those folks are now on the Bernie Sanders campaign, and Reid very much shifted left on a whole host of issues, through his interactions with these bloggers turned staffers.
And I don't think people understood, like, he was the guy who, I think, to the extent that any Democrat takes responsibility for protecting Social Security during the Obama years, because I think a lot of the credit, frankly, goes to the Freedom Caucus, because they just wouldn't, they could not make a deal, even though, they could not take yes for an answer. But to the extent that anybody does, Harry Reid not only changed, and you write about in terms of marriage equality ultimately, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, which people forget was repealed less than 10 years ago, I guess now.
Right.
He was also adamant about Social Security, and there was a conflict with him and Joe Biden. Tell us about that one.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that was, and that goes to Biden's, professed, calling card. He talks about how he can work with Republicans, and there was a particular moment after the 2012 election where all of the Bush tax cuts were expiring because they had used reconciliation, which means your legislation can only be in place for 10 years. That's what you have to give to get the 50 vote threshold. And so if Democrats did nothing, then all of the Bush tax cuts would expire. And so Reid was driving a pretty hard bargain with McConnell. And as he told me in a later interview, that's because he actually intended to go over the cliff and let the tax rates go back up, because then his argument was, now we're talking about tax cuts. Because the taxes have gone all back to their original spot. Now, okay, you want some tax cuts? Let's talk tax cuts. Let's do a middle class tax cut, and make it a huge middle class tax cut, trillions of dollars. I'm good with that. And McConnell would have to be calling for a huge tax cut for the rich. And Reid felt like, especially with Obama's 2012 reelection, that they were in a good spot to argue that. And at the last minute, he gets yanked out of it by the White House, and they send in Joe Biden. And Joe Biden, in like a day or two, cuts a far worse deal than McConnell had even already agreed to. Like, McConnell had already agreed that taxes on everybody over 250, making 250 a year, would go back up. And they were sorting out the details from there. And as we know, Reid was going to let him go over and probably wouldn't even have given him that much. But Biden comes in and basically wipes out the estate tax and says that everybody making 400 and above, so everybody between 250 and 400 gets saved by
It's
Biden.
basically like Reid was like, I'm going to sell you this car for $25,000, and Biden comes in and says, I'll take care of this. I'm going to sell you this car for $22,000. I made a deal. Because McConnell had already said, well, I'll take the car for $25,000, but I also want the car stereo. And Biden comes and goes, I'm going to give you the car stereo, and I'm going to give you the car for $22,000.
And so McConnell just reaches onto the desk and takes his $3,000 back.
Exactly.
He says, he says, okay.
Why did Biden do that?
So that's a good question. Part of it is he's not very good at his job. I don't think he's very lazy. Like that's a big knock on him. Another is that he spends a lot of time with rich people, and so to him, like maybe increasing taxes on people on the $251,000 that you make on a year seemed onerous. He just loves striking deals with McConnell and Republicans. And he also wasn't too concerned about doing a lot legislatively. So Reid wanted one reason Reid wanted to bring in that extra revenue is that they're in an era of pay-go where all of the spending had to be offset somewhere with some sort of revenue increase or cut elsewhere. And so, letting the Bush tax cuts expire gives you a ton of revenue that you can apply to new spending programs. And Reid wanted to do that. But Biden and the White House didn't seem they were very pessimistic about their ability to get anything done, get anything through Congress. So what good is the revenue anyway? But yeah, it's I asked Reid that exact question. He said, "You'd have to ask Joe."